Wally Perling was 9 years old and in the second grade, though he should have been in the fourth. Most people in town knew that he had difficulty in keeping up. He was big and clumsy, slow in movement and mind. He was always a helpful boy, a willing and smiling one, and the natural protector, paradoxically, of the underdog. Sometimes if the older boys chased the younger ones away, it would always be Wally who'd say, "Can't they stay? They're no bother." Wally fancied the idea of being a shepherd with a flute in the Christmas pageant that year, but the play's director, Miss Lombard, assigned him to a more important role. After all, she reasoned, the innkeeper did not have too many lines, and Wally's size would make his refusal of lodging to Joseph more forceful. No one on stage or off was more caught up in the magic of the night than Wallace Perling. They said later that he stood in the wings and watched the performance with such fascination that from time to time Miss Lombard had to make sure he didn't wander on stage before his cue. Then the time came when Joseph appeared, slowly, tenderly, guiding Mary to the door of the inn. Joseph knocked hard on the wooden door set into the painted backdrop. Wally, the innkeeper, was there waiting. "What do you want?" Wally said, swinging the door open with a brusque gesture. "We seek lodging." "Seek it elsewhere." Wally looked straight ahead, but spoke vigorously. "The inn is filled." "Sir, we have asked everywhere in vain. We have traveled far and are very weary." "There is no room in this inn for you." Wally looked properly stern. "Please, good innkeeper, this is my wife, Mary. She is heavy with child and needs a place to rest. Surely you must have some small corner for her. She is so tired." Now, for the first time, the innkeeper relaxed his stiff stance and looked down at Mary. With that, there was a long pause, long enough to make the audience a bit tense with embarrassment. "No, be gone," the prompter whispered from the wings. "No," Wally repeated automatically, "be gone." Joseph sadly placed his arm around Mary, and Mary laid her head upon his shoulder, and the two of them started to move away. The innkeeper did not return inside his inn, however. Wally stood there in the doorway, watching the forlorn couple. His mouth was open, his brow creased with concern, his eyes filling unmistakably with tears. "Don't go, Joseph," Wally called out. "Bring Mary back." And Wallace Perling's face grew into a bright smile. "You can have my room." Some people in town thought that the pageant had been ruined. Yet there were others, many others, who considered it the most Christmas of all Christmas pageants they had ever seen. This classic tale of Wally Perling, written by Dina Donahue and published in 1966 by Guidepost magazine, never fails to bring me back to the manger and the true reason for the season. Because you see, left to my own devices, I will become so distracted by the details of the Christmas story that I lose sight of any meaning that it might hold for me. I'm fascinated that the Greek word that's translated as inn in most Bible translations should have been translated as guest room. When Mary and Joseph arrived at their destination, Joseph's family home, the upper room, the guest room, was already filled with his relatives who had also arrived for the census and was too crowded for them to give birth. It's unlikely that Joseph's family would have turned them away while Mary was in her final days of pregnancy, despite the scandal of her being pregnant before their official marriage. So they stayed in the lower level where there was enough room for everything that goes into birthing a child. The section of the room that included a manger of hay for the animals in an adjoining room. And if I'm not careful, I'm so captivated by these new details that I never heard from the pulpit, I lose sight of the fact that Joseph's family made room for them, which makes Wally Perling's grasp of the Christmas story better than mine, and maybe better than yours too. If Luke's account of the birth of Jesus is about anything at all, it's about God making room for everyone, especially those who are usually left out. And in first century Palestine, that would have been about 95% of the people. And although online encyclopedias and history books might describe the time into which Jesus was born as a state of comparative tranquility throughout classical antiquity and the Mediterranean world, it was a peace that was achieved only through horrible political repression. Just a few years before Jesus was born, in a city only half a day's walk from the tiny village Jesus would call home, 2,000 men, women, and children were crucified and left to hang on the crosses until their flesh had all but rotted away as punishment for rebelling against Roman rule. The most crowded road was chosen for the crucifixions, where most people could see and be moved by fear. This was the supposed peace that Emperor Augustus proclaimed, a peace enforced by the Roman military. And so a heavenly army of angels appeared one night to some shepherds. I know you've always heard it was a heavenly host. And you thought host may have meant something like a choir since they all started singing. But a host is an army. These weren't a bunch of namby-pamby angels warming up for a concert. They were ready to do battle, and their battle cry of God's peace on earth was in direct opposition to the false peace of the empire. And all of this information may be new and fascinating to some people, but what's important to remember is that it's a story about God making room for the outsiders of the day, for shepherds, and for a pregnant couple looking for shelter, and for peasants, and for people living in fear of the empire. That's for whom the tidings of great joy were intended. And we can see it as a heartwarming first century equivalent of a Hallmark Christmas special that we will tuck away safely with all our Christmas decorations, only to be pulled out next year around this time. Or we can keep the story alive by making room for the peasants and shepherds and pregnant couples of our own day. We can insist on making room for 31-year-old Kate Cox, who was essentially left with two choices. She could carry her non-viable pregnancy to term, which her doctors say could threaten her future fertility and even her life, or she could pay to leave Texas and seek an abortion elsewhere. We can keep the story alive by making room for immigrants like Ingrid Lopez, who are the targets of a new Texas law that authorizes police to arrest people they suspect crossed the Rio Grande between ports of entry. Ingrid traveled over 18 days and more than 2,200 miles to El Paso without work and fleeing political persecution, she and her husband made the demanding trek with their daughter Emily to offer the 13-year-old a safe life. We can keep the story alive by making room for transgender people who are being persecuted these days. People who not only have battled suicidal thoughts when they hid their truth, but who are made to feel like criminals for living their truth. We make room for them when we use their correct pronouns and names, and when we vote out any lawmaker with an anti-transgender voting record. We can keep the story alive by making room for the unhoused people in our neighborhood who depend on our outdoor pantry. We can make sure there's food for them and clothing to keep them warm. And if we encounter them while they're using the pantry, we can engage them as equals, introducing ourselves and asking if they would like something to drink as well. Christmas is about familiar carols and houses decorated with colorful lights and exchanging presents and delicious food. But it's also about making room for anyone who has been left out. So let's ensure that we make room for everyone all year long, not just during the Christmas season. For in doing so, we join forces not only with the Wally Perlings of the world, but with an army of angels who brought tidings of great joy, peace, and goodwill among all people. Amen.